Welcome to PanLab Podcast. I'm Akansha, and I'm a psychologist and an independent researcher in the field of affective neuroscience. So, while digging deep down to the human behavioral, not only from psychological perspective but biological and more importantly neurobiological perspective, there is a lot of myth associated with a lot of psychological disorders, biological disorders, and the disorders which relate to the functioning of the brain. Our aim is to understand it from the background of understanding how exactly your body and mind function, what we have been able to explore and reveal till now, what we understand with our knowledge till this very point, and what things are still unexplained about the nature of our existence. All right. So, science is constantly evolving. It changes the old theories, which have been proved at one point. It brings more information to that. It adds new modification to it, or it completely debunks it. So, as the science evolves, we will also evolve our understanding of it. There are very fundamental psychological definitions of certain things which help us to differentiate and understand them in a better perspective, a better framework, so to say. So, today we are going to talk about two such frameworks, and we'll try to understand that these terms, which seems very common, very simplistic, and we understand them, but what is exactly about them which we don't understand? So, topic for today is motivation and goals. Now, the distinction between motivation and goal is not very clear. So, for our sake of understanding, we'll oversimplify to make this case. Roughly speaking, motivations set goals, and emotions orient you in relationships to those goals. Like I said, these categories often overlap. For example, anger usually is considered emotion, and often it has a goal. The goal is to hit something or hurt something or someone. That's one possible goal. So we can see that emotion can very easily segue into motivation. So for now, we understand motivations as something that set goals and emotions that orients you in relationship to those goals. So how you're going to behave and respond, and how those responses behavior changes in respect to the goal setting. That's what is somehow navigated by your emotions. But motivation setting goal, it's actually more complicated than that. Motivations not only set goals, they also prime your behavior. So they also set up the perceptual frame within which you interpret the world. So for example, if you're hungry, let's say, it isn't that you're driven to eat like an uncivilized mad person would, right? First of all, eating is a very complex behavior, especially when it's associated with food procurement, say. And the system that we have used in past to procure food and then to ingest, they're sort of disinhibited by the motivations. Procurement of the food, ingesting of the food requires a lot of time, even when your hunger is at the peak, and your motivational state of being really hungry means that those systems will be stopped. You won't have that much of a processing power to hold and have patience to not immediately gorge on the food. So your sensory system is attuned so that it will focus on things relevant to eating, and it will tune out everything else. So your motivational states also does perceptual tuning. And then there's this felt component to it as well. So it's not reasonable to say that motivation simply set goals, because they're driving behavior. So essentially they do three things here: goal setting, behavioral driving, plus it provides with those perceptual schema within which those other two things make sense. So it's giving you a framework to understand that motivational behavior and that goal itself. So in some sense, motivational states is like a one-eyed personality, a micro personality. If we really align with the psychoanalytical idea, which says that you are nothing but a loose aggregation of these micro personalities. And these micro-personalities often has got just one aim, like for example, hunger has got one aim, that is to satisfy the hunger. Anger has got only one aim, to take it out some way or the other. The other motivational states, like your sexual drive, have got only one aim, that they are looking to satisfy themselves in that manner. And we are made up of all these motivational states, which have been described by Freud as id, your most primordial instincts, rather animal instincts. But they're not that animal instincts, but yes, you can say that when these motivational states are at their full power, there is no way that you're able to fight those instincts or intuitions, because whenever it's about your hypothalamic instincts and your prefrontal cortex area of your brain, which is essentially doing all the executive administrative work, strategizing, planning, making you think logically and reasonably. It is that region of your brain which infuses all the understanding and logical aspect of the understanding and controls your out of control emotions. So whenever there's a fight between these hypothalamic instincts, now hypothalamus generally associated with the emotional regulation, and if these motivational states, any of these motivational states get to its peak, or they are looking to get what they really, really want, it's very hard for your prefrontal cortex to suppress that instinct or suppress that urge for that matter, because these instincts are essentially there to make you survive in the world. And whenever it's about your survival or doing the right thing, which is the harder thing to do, people go for the survival. So this psychoanalytical idea that you are aggregation of multiple fragmented personalities that sort of coherently tied together at highest level of analysis, but they can go off and do their own thing. And you see that in situations like eating disorder, where the hunger system itself start to almost spun off part of personality, and the rest of the elements of personalities battle with that. And in some sense, that's like cortex versus hypothalamus. Again, as we talked about it, hypothalamus is one of the things that keep you alive. So you could do without your cortex, but you cannot do without your hypothalamus. It regulates your body temperature, your hunger, your emotional regulations, your sexual regulation, your reproductive regulation, everything associated with your survival. And these connections are actually stretching upwards from the hypothalamus, which is very, very old area and much more powerful, than connections which are coming down from cortex to modulate hypothalamus. Now that's another indication of who's in charge when the chips are down. That's why it's so difficult for you to override your basic emotion or motivation state. It's like the system evolved to keep you alive, and it's not particularly willing to give away control in sense that your survival is staked on its function. So if you just stay in human side of psychology instead of wandering to animal behavior research, you can see that most of human psychologists and neuropsychologists, they're very cortical centric. They really like to think that it's the newly part of brain that's in charge. And I don't think so that's completely right. Because the newly evolved part of brain are in charge only when nothing is bothering you. Like you're not hungry, you're not thirsty, you're not too excited, not too curious, not too terrified, you're not cold, you're not too warm. Any of those, then the cortex is in charge, no doubt about it. You can think more clearly that time, you can focus on things which are relevant, you can do the right thing, which is a harder thing to do. That's the main purpose of the cortex, to make you do the right thing when it's actually the hardest thing to do. But only if none of the basic motivational states and emotional states are bothering you. But if you deviate substantially, if any of these motivational states are not taken care of, or they are not in a proper balance, then the fact that your behavioral output will be mostly dominant by these primordial brain regions. And the probability of that is very high. You see the same thing happen, maybe if you're having a discussion with someone, right? And they exhaust limit of their rational knowledge, or they exhaust the limit of your rational knowledge. That means that you can't argue with them further, or they are not able to argue with you further. rationally. So now what happens usually is that the people will just break down into tears or they'll get really, really angry. It's like that out of their cortex pan right into the lower and more primordial evolutionary determined systems. Okay, so we are going to look at the functions of brain first in a more general way, and then we're going to narrow it down to the highest level of resolution. That is, we're going to look at it in more detail and in more specific areas. Now, the question that we are trying to address here is that what exactly the problem is. The problem that your brain is wrestling with. And the major problem is that reality is so complicated. It has so many layers and so many interconnected causal links that's actually very complex beyond comprehension. So you can think about, complexity at subatomic level, then at atomic level, it's again complex out there. Then we go to the molecular level, the complexity of its own. Then it's extremely complex structure that emerge out of this molecular level, especially in living organism. And then there's with the totality of your brain. And brain is so much complex than everything else in the universe that it's not even in the same categories. Gerald Edman said, and it's a very beautiful quote, that there are more pattern of connections in your brain than there are subatomic particles in universe. So that's actually a majorly complex thing there, and there's a lot of them around. They're all integrated into families, tribal groups, and then they get large enough to be a nation. So we are always embedded inside some biological system, and so on and so forth, all the way out into the limits of the cosmos. So this is one complicated place, and your job in large part is to understand it, but also not to become overwhelmed by it. Because you've got to simplify at a point where you can think about one thing and do one thing, so you have to screen out everything else. All that complexity has to be tuned out so that it doesn't overwhelm you. So part of your brain is always wrestling with the fact that what can I ignore? And I guess the answer to it is almost everything. And that's a problem. It's not always obvious what is okay to ignore because you have imperfect knowledge. You can think of something irrelevant and it can turn out to be of critical importance. So it's a deadly difficult problem. One of the ways we solve this is we're actually pretty blind to almost everything. Our sensory input, like with vision, you see a very little slice of the whole electromagnetic spectrum, and same with the sounds. And we can only touch things which are basically within our reach, so that limits things substantially. And also there are things we can't detect, like there's a sense we don't have. We can't detect infrared rays like snakes can, and other magnetic fields like some of the marine animals can. So the point here is that our body takes care of the fact that we are ignoring most of the things that's happening around which are not relevant to us or not relevant to what we are trying to do. And that sensory limitation is very, very apparent. You can see only a limited stuff and you can hear only a limited length of a sound wave. You can touch very limited things which are within your reach. So there was this experiment that was conducted, and it was a room filled with people who were trying to dribble the basketball. And people were asked to count how many dribbles were done and how many players are there. And while doing so, suddenly a gorilla appears into the picture and goes back. And then the experiment was stopped and asked that how many of them noticed gorilla in it. Very few of the people were able to notice that, and otherwise most of the people were just focused on counting the number of dribbles. So the aim of the experiment was to actually debunk the theory that we pay attention if anything novel or anything abnormal happens. That's actually not true. You shift your attention only and only when something interferes with what you're trying to do. If it's not interfering, everything else is irrelevant and we are very, very tuned out of it. So that was a major league finding during that time, because till that time we were just focusing on the fact that yes, the attention shifting happens when anything new attracts our attention or anything abnormal happening in the normal pattern of the things that you were doing. But whereas the attention is actually more focused on what you're doing, and it only shifts when something interferes with what you're trying to focus upon. So what your brain sort of assume is that if you're looking at something, everything else is irrelevant and it's sort of fade away in the background. So the rule of perception is don't pay attention to anything that isn't directly relevant to the desired outcome. Now, how exactly you calculate what you pay attention to and what not, that's a very complicated problem. I mean, you build that knowledge bit by bit over time, and you can be wrong about it too. So it only comes with the experience. So the old idea that you are conscious of your environment, if any radical changes happen, you'll definitely notice. And what turns out to be the case is, well, you're not very conscious of the environment. And if radical things can happen, you won't notice them unless they interfere with what you're doing. So if something emerges that interferes with what you're doing that you don't expect, you'll instantly orient towards that. So it isn't anomaly or novelty that attracts your attention. It's the unexpected disruption of the relationship between your behavior and the desired outcomes of those behavior that attracts your attention. Only pay attention to things that make you fail. It's something like that. Or at least additionally pay attention to things that can make you fail. And generally speaking, that's also associated with emotional response. So if you're doing something that you know how to do and something unexpected happens suddenly, you're going to have an emotional reaction to it, and the emotional reaction partly prepares you for the worst. In case this unexpected thing is actually bigger than you thought of. And it also primes your curiosity in some way. So you start to explore, what it is so that you can reconstruct your expectations and decide in accordance with the transforming world. Now, according to how you want them to go, the things that you're trying to pursue, one of the ways that we do it is that we can really pretend that the world is unbelievably simple. And all it consists of those few things that you're doing in your little bounded perceptual frame. And everything else is irrelevant. Everything else is simply zero. And unfortunately, every now and then, this hypothesis that everything is zero is radically wrong. Like when your computer crashes, then you actually have to deal with those complex parts of the computers that you don't understand much how they really function, and you have to probably give it to some expert to do it. And that's actually really anxiety provoking. So you can imagine the same situation when you're driving in a car. You're smoothly driving in a car and suddenly it breaks down in the middle of the road. Now, till this very moment, the car was nothing but an object to take you from point A to point B. But as soon as it breaks down, it suddenly becomes something that you don't understand anymore, because it's a collection of troublesome parts for you now, and none of which you know anything about. Plus, it's disrupted your day, it's disrupted your mood, it disrupted your pocketbook. Plus, now you'll have to deal with a bunch of people who are going to tell you what's exactly wrong with it and charge you for it, which you have no way to analyze whether it's reasonable or not. So that's almost impossible to overestimate the degree to which we live within a world that's bounded by our expectations and desires, and how much we spend keeping everything complex away from us, like way away from us, so that we don't have to deal with it. And in order to understand that, you might ask yourself that you organize yourselves as per your goals. So where does this goal exactly come from? We know that motivation set goals, but how are we motivated, or what are the things actually inciting that motivation in us? So, organizing our perception as per our goals and goals being set up by the motivation. So, what exactly is happening here? We have heard from thinkers like Sigmund Freud, who talked about id function, and that it is sort of a seat of primordial impulses, right? So you might think about it as the primary producer of goals or drives. Freud did think about them as drives. And as I mentioned before, it's a flawed state because motivational state is more than merely a drive. Why? Because drive is something that triggers a pre-programmed sequence of behavior. And a lot of those behaviors are like animal responses. Like an animal encounters stimulus, and that stimulus would produce a response, and the response is what get chained together. And when that animal encountered that stimulus again, then that chain responses would automatically run, which was proved wrong in a very famous experiment where you can train rats to run through a maze and rat actually learn how to figure out the new clues. So they learn, they go on and they can generalize from it like you do. So the notion that drives are simply a sequence of pre-programmed behaviors turns out to be completely wrong. There's some limits and circumstances under which it's right, but otherwise it's not. So the hypothesis that we are going to entertain is that you need to have a framework of the world in order to interact with it. If you don't know how you will orient yourself in this world, if you don't have a framework for orienting yourself or the perceptual frame within which you're going to operate, you do not know what you're really dealing with here then. So your ancient symbol of chaos is like something that you don't know. You don't understand what you're looking at. So you can say that chaos is all that complexity that surrounds you, which can at any possible time intrude in your safe world. So you have to grasp that chaos and operate within it. And for that, you need to have a framework. You need to put yourself within a framework and also put that chaos within that framework in order to deal with it. In parts, culture is what outside you, but it's also the frameworks that you have learned by interacting with other people. To narrow and specify the world, my mode of thinking it as the framing is associated with security at one hand, because it tells you what you can do and make things safe for you, and tyranny on the other hand, because it can get out of control every now and then and it can start to get too rigid. Whatever, regardless of the pros and cons of framing is what we need in order to move and orient ourselves in the world. If you see something in one way, then you can't see it another way. It's harder to see it like that. So that's one very, very major disadvantage of framing. It doesn't give you exposure of other viewpoints or perceptions. But the pro side of framing is, well, then you can do something. You can actually be more aware of how you are thinking and what you're trying to achieve and how you're going to do about that without getting overwhelmed by all the complexity of the unknowns surrounding you. If it's unframed, then you are in chaos. It's existential anxiety. You're not going to move ahead like that. You have to frame things. You have to simplify them. And really to do so is that never make your perceptual task any more complex than it has to be in order to get done what you need to get done. So in psychology, we are trying to be within a perceptual framework, which is set according to our goals in order to orient ourselves and also to keep moving forward towards those goals. And your emotional responses are going to be attuned as per how you're really moving forward and orienting yourself. But at the same time, the goals keep changing, they keep evolving. It's a very iterative process that has to be kept in mind. It's not something, it's not a fixed process. We change it, our goals as per the demands, as per the new information that we get, as per the situational changes. But when we trying to understand it from a biological perspective, we will make our best case not to fall for any categorical thinking and try to understand it from different fields of sciences and the different ways of looking at it so that we can get something closer to a complete picture. So in order to understand, how do you frame things? Now, first of all, a lot of framing doesn't happen psychologically because, for example, you're sitting at your home or in your office or wherever, and you're not overwhelmed by the chaos. Well, why? First, you're in a city, that's helpful, right? There's electricity here. There's people to fix all your plumbing, all your drainage things, or whatever thing that is out of place. So the fact that you're in a functional city makes life a lot more simpler. And we don't really often give too much credit to the fact that you are actually surviving in a city which is very functional, that is not overwhelming you with the chaos, that it can actually work. So the fact that there's nothing that's going to eat you, like an animal or a predator. So that's the whole of a complexity that civilized world has already taken care for you. There's something that you also have to do, but there's a bunch of things that you don't have to worry about. Now, taking the example of a terror management theory here, now terror management theory accounts why people are so connected to their beliefs, why they're so adamant about their beliefs, or why they adopt a belief system. And as per them, the idea is that a belief system protects you from death anxiety. So even Freud sort of said that about religious system, and that was his critique of the religion. People have a fear of death, so they have this desire to have that fear go away. So they turn to religion. And religion says death is not permanent. That's why people are religious. And the extension of that idea is that that's why they have belief systems in general. They're trying to protect themselves against the deep shaking anxiety of dying. And to some degree, I suspect that's true. But you should also remember that when you're protecting your cultural self, the one you identify with, and the way you are attached to your belief systems, or whatever that your culture is worth defending for, you're not just defending something that's psychological here. It's like the functioning culture keeps the lights on. So it doesn't just protect you from death anxiety. There's a psychological component to it too. But you never want to underestimate the practical utility of being nested inside a functional society or a functional nation. So Piaget was a developmental psychologist, really, really great at his work. He would consider it as a functional game. So it's like your world is a lot simpler and you have to maintain a kind of a drag. That's the tyrannical element. Maybe. But the payoff are pretty big. So a functional culture does not just protect you from death anxiety. It's actually protecting you from the death itself. It's keeping the lights on. It's providing for you. So most people I see have at least one serious problem. It might be that they have illness, or if they don't have illness, then one of their immediate family member that's got some awful illness, or they're very old and they need to be taken care of, or they're suffering from some insane economic problem, or they've just been unemployed, whatever. There's something in their immediate circle that's really, really difficult to grapple with. And yet you see people still go out and maintain their places in the world. They're fighting it off. They go, they function every single day. They do something productive with their lives. They take care of the things. They try at least to take care and manage all the problems of their life and of their loved ones. And the whole thing roughly works. And that's sort of, it's like a continuous source of amazement that people can actually pull that off. So that's what humans are capable of doing. And that's how your nation or a society becomes functional. So the next level at which things get screened out for you is by your body. You can naturally see things at particular level of resolution. There isn't obvious why that should be, but you can just see the front of the people. You can't see the back of them. Their external covering their skin and clothes. You can't see inside them, right? You also cannot see in what social structure they're embedded. So if I look at you, I can't see your family. I can presume that you have, but I can't see that, and I can't see the political situation that surrounds you or what your political beliefs are. So part of the way complexity screens out is that your body doesn't allow you to pick it up. You're just blind to it. So you see at one level of resolution, and that's the human level. So how practically usable things are is what defines perceptibility, so that it screens out the rest. So then what you're left with is, well, you have to deal with once everything being screened out. You might ask, well, there's still a lot of complexity left there. Like to say, there's a lot of complexity within an average family, right? There's a plenty of complexity in mating environment, finding a partner, establishing a reasonable long-term relationship, having children, raising them. There's a plenty of complexity around that. Then the question is, how did biology come to solve those problems given that there's infinite complexity? How do you actually do it? And the answer to it is, fundamentally, it's a Darwinian answer. So there is a lot of evidence around the realm that organisms are much more complicated at genetic level than anyone ever assumed. And bacteria, for example, they constantly swap DNA back and forth with other bacteria all the time. And there are experiences that you can have that will change your genetic structure sufficiently so that you can transmit that to your children. Because we have the genes which manifest themselves with the changing environment. So by putting yourself into more challenging situations and the novel environments, you can actually trigger those sleeping genes and they will manifest themselves, and then a lot of changes in the genetic structure can happen. So that's where you see the people who really travel from one country to another and settle down into their non-native places are able to adopt certain things and bring certain changes at the genetic structure, which they can then pass on to their offspring. So their offspring would be more of having the genetic structure which will be somewhat of that region that they have been born into, even though natively they may belong to some different country. So your genes does manifest themselves as per the environment and the experiences that you have. So the more changes, variations, and challenges you bring to your experiences and environment, better probability of changes in genetic structure. It could be bad, it could be the worst. Sometimes stress-oriented environments or stress-oriented challenges bring certain changes in your genetic structures which are not that desirable. So the idea that everything is purely Darwinian and it's only mutation that drives randomness are clearly likely, but not complete. Other mechanisms are clearly there. But the issue is that you start with something so that it kind of works. And you produce these micro variants of it, and the world around you changes a bit. And hopefully one of those micro variants are able to do same things, and it produces a bunch of more micro variants. And then they manage to do same things. So what's happening is that there's an arm race between the environment that's always changing and the organisms that are trying to keep up with it. And that arm race goes on and on forever. And different life forms proliferate. That's the curve, right? So it's like life is always playing catch up and you just never get it right. You cannot get it right. The best you can do is you can just get it right long enough to live long enough to reproduce. So this is what is constituted by the sum total of our knowledge. What that means is that part of you are all beneficiary of this evolutionary system that's going on from the beginning of life, and that's about roughly 3.5 billion years ago. The more still a consequence of these 3.5 billion years of effort and death. So my point is, part of the way complexity is dealt with is haphazard because it isn't actually dealt with. That's why you die. You can only manage it to a limited degree. And for us, it's like 2 or 3 kids and 100 years. And that's it. That's our knowledge after all these billion years. I think that would be all on the topic of motivation, goals, and emotion for now. Thank you so much for listening, sparing some time, and thank you for showing your interest in science.